For Family by Nanook888. Chapter 7. Luke's Father. For an eternal moment, nobody moved. All sound faded away. Even the hiss of Vader's respirator went unnoticed. Leia's shocked gaze traveled from Luke to Vader to the hand resting on her friend's shoulder and returned to rest on Luke again. Vader dropped his hand and took a step back. Leia stirred as if the movement had released her from a spell. Her face morphed into an expression of utter incredulity. "Is that what he told you?" she exclaimed. "Leia," Luke started. His mouth continued to move, but he found that no words were forthcoming. His guilty expression was almost more than she could take. Deep concern, verging on desperation, now lined her face, her rapidly changing expressions reflecting the tumultuous emotions within. She approached him, her eyes pleading. "It's not true, Luke," she implored, grasping at possible explanations. "He's manipulating you to turn you to the dark side." "On Bespin, yes, but he's not like that anymore," Luke tried to explain. She blinked. "Not like that anymore? Luke, it's Vader! How is he not like that anymore?" She glanced nervously at the towering form standing motionless behind her friend. "It's a long story, and I can't go into detail, but the bottom line is that I know he's changed. I'm sorry, Leia," he said, as if he had committed a terrible crime. His blue eyes were so apologetic, saddened by that pain he must be causing her. "No!" Horror welled up inside, and she realized gradually that her head was shaking side to side over and over as if of its own accord. "He can't be." Vader spoke for the first time. "A DNA test would prove conclusive." Her gaze moved back and forth between them, her brown eyes twice their normal size. Luke and Vader were watching her intently in return, and suddenly it became too much. "Leave me," she whispered, turning away from them. "Leia," Luke tried again. "Please," she breathed. It was barely a sound. Feeling as if his heart would burst, Luke nodded and headed out of his own rooms, followed closely by his father. Luke, of all people, the son of her worst enemy? Leia's hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself, bracing against a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night breeze in the small hours of the morning. Desperately needing to be alone, and feeling as if the walls were caving in on her, she had slipped outside, away from Chewie's watchful guard. Without conscious attention, her feet carried her meandering down the rocky path carved into the cliffs below the Theed royal palace. It couldn't be true. The thought was too much to bear. Since Han had been taken, Luke had been her rock, the one stable thing in their chaotic lives. And she knew that she had been his. They had angered themselves on each other, mentally and emotionally, to seek solace and strength as they both suffered. For many months now, she had been wishing that Luke would confide in her, certain that she could alleviate his distress somehow. But had she known that this was what he'd been so troubled by, she would have demanded they discuss it straight after Bespin and put in mind at ease in an instant. What a waste for Luke to have lost those months in useless pain! But her strength seemed to vanish in the wake of her mental outburst, and her shoulders drooped. A sound that was something between a strangled cry and a sob escaped her. Deep down inside, she knew that all her ranting was hopeless. For no reason that she could fathom, she just knew that it was true. Why Luke had been so traumatized? The terrible truth that he had concealed even from her? Perhaps especially from her? That scene was forever carved into her memory. Nothing had been right about it. Her usually soft-spoken friend arguing so emphatically with Vader. The Dark Lord himself casually throwing his arms up in the air in frustration. "I can't lose you, Father." It had to be a mistake, a slip of the tongue, some twisted hallucination conjured up by her tired mind. Vader would refute it, and that would be that. But no! Shockingly, he'd done the exact opposite. With a tenderness she'd never imagined Vader to possess, he had placed a hand on Luke's shoulder in a fatherly gesture. Her shock had erupted into outright horror to realize that she believed it too. There was no good reason to think it could be true. For one, there was nothing even close to a resemblance in their physical stature. Luke was positively diminutive next to Vader's towering build. She also knew Luke's father to be Anakin Skywalker, a legendary Jedi Knight from the Clone Wars, the hero with no fear. Her thoughts flickered to Luke's mother. Judging by Luke's age, identical to hers, down to the exact day, he must have been conceived in the waning days of the Old Republic, months before the galaxy had first heard of Darth Vader. She could imagine someone wanting to bear the child of Anakin Skywalker, but Darth Vader's? Besides, who knew if he was even human inside that suit? There were so many arguments to refute the claim, but nonetheless, the little nugget of information seemed to wedge itself firmly in her mind, immovable in the face of all the evidence to the contrary. Something about it just seemed to click in her mind, as if it had been the missing piece of the puzzle all along. And it didn't help that everything from Luke's behavior after Bespin to all that had occurred with Ferrigno made perfect sense if Vader was indeed Luke's father. Vader was the very face of her nightmares. There wasn't a single soul for whom she felt more anger, hate, or, yes, she admitted, or fear. Not even Palpatine could command such personal animosity from her. And now it was as if Luke had been tainted by Vader's dark shroud and he suddenly felt like a stranger, hurled galaxies away from her in just a few short seconds. Worse still were the niggling doubts which had started crawling around in her mind as to Luke's intentions. Did he still fight for freedom and democracy? What if he had secretly joined Vader already? Could Vader's plans to overthrow Palpatine be, in fact, their plan? An elaborate scheme to overthrow both the Empire and the Alliance in the shadow of the peace negotiations? She quickly shook her head to dispel such dark suspicions. She knew Luke didn't agree with Vader's ideals. His being so traumatized by the revelation on Bespin was proof of that. And whatever trap the Dark Lord was setting, she reminded herself that she had not been taken in by the duplicity. Her lips pursed in grim resolve as she took it upon herself to protect her friend from whatever schemes Vader might be hatching. Luke needed her now, more than ever, and she was not about to abandon him to the Dark Lord's mercies. It was at that moment that she abruptly smacked face first into a wall and scuffed her toes. Much too late, she realized that she had been paying no attention to her surroundings, and she muttered a Corellian curse she must have picked up from Han. She blinked to focus her eyes, only to find her vision filled with unmistakable black armor. She jumped back, heart leaping into her throat, eyes widening as she looked up to the dreaded mask. She froze as a human face stared back at her as equally startled as she. Familiar blue eyes stared out of a pale face with chiseled features. A long scar shone in the moonlight, running under his left eye, over the cheek, and past his ear. Short spreads of hair grew on his head, though it was too dark to see their color. Emerging from the suit of Darth Vader was a face she recognized all too well from her clandestine history lessons of another age. Her eyes widened, and her voice was no more than a whisper. "Anakin Skywalker?" There was a resigned sigh, and then an entirely unfamiliar voice. "Yes, I am Anakin." It was not the deep, terrifying rumble of Vader's vocalizer, but a softer, richer timbre. An icy chill gripped her as she registered the evidence before her eyes. 22 years ago, Anakin Skywalker had suddenly disappeared off the face of the galaxy, exactly when Vader had appeared out of nowhere. But the Dark Lord hadn't killed Skywalker as everybody had believed. Anakin Skywalker had become Darth Vader. Feeling as if she would suffocate, she turned to rush away. "Princess!" The pressing tone made her stop, despite her better judgment. "Please, no one must know." Leia spun to face him. "To know what? That you're a fraud? That the suit is all a sham?" "This," Vader said tiredly, waving vaguely at his head, "is only recent. A week ago I couldn't live without the suit, nor breathe normal air without the respirator. The respirator itself was only modified 2 days ago to emulate the sound of full functionality." "And this is what you'd like to keep secret?" she asked curtly. "Yes. No. Not quite." Vader shifted uncomfortably. "It's complicated." Leia crossed her arms, tilted her head, and arched a brow expectantly. Stubbornness was etched in her every line. Anakin looked away, painfully reminded of someone else when she looked like that. He didn't know whether it was the uncanny resemblance or Luke's trust in her, but he found himself explaining.
I have no problem in admitting who I am. I might even say that it's tempting to live without this armor to see my son.
He stopped himself. His wishes and dreams were none of her concern.
But there are many who would easily recognize me, and Skywalker is not a common name. If it became public knowledge that Luke was related to me in any way, let alone my son.
He glanced at her.
If you cannot accept it, then there would be few others who could. He would be rejected by all those he knows. His life would never be the same again.
There was a pause as she took in his words. He was worried for Luke? It was too incredible to believe, and she couldn't help wondering what he would say about his mother. I see, she said smoothly with mock understanding. So your concern is for Luke's well-being. Were you similarly concerned for his mother, or did you force her to bear your child? Vader's reaction was instantaneous. He drew himself up and towered over her like a violent, storm-clad finger, pointing angrily at her face.
Whatever else I am guilty of, Your Highness, you cannot accuse me of not loving my wife.
She blinked, momentarily taken aback at his passionate outburst, but then snapped back at him with renewed vigor. Like you love your son?
Yes,
of course you do, she exclaimed with biting sarcasm. It's so obvious, what with your actions on Bespin being so demonstrative of fatherly concern. There was no denying the pain that flashed across his face before he turned away from her, and to her astonishment, he seemed to wilt visibly before her eyes. There was a heavy sigh.
As I explained to Luke, came the quiet response. That hadn't been my intention. I was another person then, fueled by the dark side.
Leia had always been a good judge of character, never falling for the honey-coated poison of corrupt, power-hungry senators, and she was baffled to detect no deception in his remorse. Vader opened his mouth as if to say something else, but closed it again. She waited as he seemed to battle within himself, staring out into the moonlit landscape as he had been when she had collided into him, for which she was secretly thankful. She might have simply walked off the ledge otherwise.
Luke would never tell you this, but perhaps you should know. It was after I maimed him that I told him I was his father.
There was a pained pause.
I have never seen anyone so appalled. He threw himself a mile down the reactor shaft just to get away from me.
Leia stared at the back of Anakin's head with the short, recent growth of hair. She briefly saw a picture of Luke flinging himself bodily away from Vader, and she could imagine something of the nightmarish ordeal that must have been their encounter in Cloud City. How much Luke must have suffered. Her heart went out to him, and the imagery helped to separate Luke from Vader in her mind. What puzzled her, however, was why Vader was telling her this. To all appearances, he appeared to be trying to save his son's friendship with her, but Vader was no fan of hers. She had been an irritating thorn in his side for too long. What could he be up to? Judging that he was unlikely to be forthcoming along that line of questioning, she changed the subject with the first thing that came to her mind. Luke must have been pleased to hear your operation was successful.
Vader froze. He doesn't know. He mustn't know.
She looked at him. Even if it wasn't common knowledge, I'm sure he would appreciate knowing that your health is better.
Vader glared at his helmet and mask resting on a rocky outcrop beside him. You know him better than I do. If he discovered that I didn't need this wretched thing anymore, don't you think he would insist that I do away with it? Then we'd be back again to why I wish to hide our relationship.
Is it so uncomfortable? She asked, genuinely curious. Unexpectedly, the bitterness melted away from his face.
No more than I deserve,
he murmured. He turned to her, his expression anxious.
Would you agree not to speak of this?
She was immediately uncomfortable at the thought of hiding this from Luke, at the thought that he could be standing next to Vader with no clue of how close he was to seeing his father's real face, or looking into those blue eyes which he had clearly inherited. But she had to admit, as improbable as it was for her to agree with Vader on anything, that the Dark Lord was probably right on this one. Knowing Luke, he would most likely assist on revealing Anakin Skywalker to the galaxy with no care of the adverse consequences to himself. For Luke's sake, I won't speak of it. For now, at least. She would have to reconsider if the concealment began to endanger lives or the Alliance. Vader seemed relieved at this small concession and tilted his head in acknowledgement. "But I'll be watching you," she warned. "I don't know what your intentions are, but I won't let you hurt him." She had expected Vader to be offended by her audacity to warn him about his own son, but his expression only softened as he gave her a faint smile.
He is fortunate to have such a loyal friend.
Leia didn't even consider whether he could possibly be genuine in that sentiment. Deeming their conversation to be over, she gave him a gracious nod and turned to walk away. She hadn't taken 2 steps before his voice stopped her.
"Princess."
She froze, suddenly afraid to look at him. There was something about his wary tone that made her hair stand on end.
"I owe you a serious, personal apology. My treatment of you on the Death Star was deplorable. There is no excuse for what I did."
Nausea swept up her throat. All through the long debates, she had been suppressing the painful memories threatening to overwhelm her, a near impossible task when facing that deathly mask across the conference table. But somehow miraculously, she had managed. Now, however, Vader had verbally brought the incident to the fore, and her body burned as though his words had reignited the excruciating sensations of the torture all over again. She violently tried to shove the terrifying feeling away. Anger surged automatically in defense as she rounded on him. "If this is some underhanded ploy to win favors with Luke—"
"I assure you it is no such thing,"
Vader interrupted, his voice strangely too kind to coming from him.
"It would be a lie to say that Luke's fondness for you didn't affect my decision to apologize, but I am sorry. It is not something that I could do now."
She fumed silently, unwilling to accept his apology. Even if it was sincere, it was too little, too late.
"I cannot reverse the harm I caused you on the Death Star, but I might possibly undo some of my actions on Bespin. If you would allow me, I will rescue Captain Solo from Boba Fett."
"Han!" Desperate longing and frightful concern surged through her in equal measure. Could Vader possibly be in earnest? She frantically searched his face for any sign of cruel mockery, but his expression remained solemn as he levelly returned her gaze. She took a deep breath as she regained her composure with an effort. Still firmly holding any hope at bay, she said, "Very well, you may assist us in rescuing Han. If he is alive and well, that would be some small measure of recompense." She didn't say what she would do if he wasn't, but her flashing eyes spoke volumes. Anakin was no stranger to the crippling devastation of the loss of a loved one, and wasn't surprised at the implied threat. In fact, it was quite an understatement compared to how he himself had reacted when Padme had been lost to him. Indeed, the whole galaxy was still staggering from the effects. Why the princess had fallen for some irritating smart-mouthed smuggler was beyond him, but it was of no consequence to him. He would reunite them, effectively returning them to how he had found them, and leave them to it. Leia watched closely as Vader nodded to her, then reached for his mask. She wondered at his thoughts as he froze, staring grimly at the ominous face that had become synonymous with terror and oppression. There was a long pause before he spoke in a soft, haunted voice.
"My crimes are not my son's, Your Highness."
Then the mask was fixed on his face, followed swiftly by the helmet. With a touch of a button on the control panel on his chest, the chilling hiss of his respirator filled the night air. There was a soft knock at the door. "Luke?" As if he had been primed to trigger at the sound of Leia's voice, Luke was awake from his fitful slumber in an instant and rushed to open the door. Uncertain of his reception, he came to an abrupt halt in the doorway and anxiously searched her face for any indication of her state of mind. She simply gave him a tired smile and held her arms open. There was a moment's pause as he gazed at her questioningly, but then he gave up trying to understand and simply embraced her. The darkness fluttered, agitated by some unknown upheaval. Palpatine frowned in displeasure as his senses were disrupted by the unnatural flow. The chief engineer picked up on the Emperor's expression and mistook it for disapproval of his report. With barely concealed urgency, he hastened to reassure the supreme authority in the galaxy. "Your Majesty, I assure you that these incidents will have no effect on production. We have already drafted in new labor, and I assure you that the staff are fully appreciative of what is expected of them." He would never actually use the word slaves, but the meaning was clear. "Within 2 days we will be back on schedule, and indeed after that we will be able to increase the pace and bring forward the plan to completion. Palpatine's mind was elsewhere, but this man was in charge of a vital project, making him important enough to warrant more consideration than a curt dismissal. The Emperor spent several more minutes reassuring him and approving the final phase before taking his leave in a more courteous manner. Once alone in his private chambers, the benign Emperor visage he liked to adopt for the public gave way to a dark, ugly scowl. For one who could read the ebb and flow of the Force so masterfully, the building agitation was like a bright flare spelling changes afoot on the horizon, where the disturbances only a few weeks ago were questionable. Suspicions at best, judging by the increased shift in the Force. It was clear that those who conspired against the Empire were now stepping up their plans. And even before he began his meditations, there was one obvious nuisance that needed no pointers. The negotiations in Theed, where his apprentice would once again be meeting the young Skywalker. Trusting that the mounting restlessness of the Force would now prove more revealing, Darth Sidious sank into deep meditation. All too soon, the third and final day of the official negotiations were upon them. Outwardly, Luke exuded assured serenity, the very image of the peacekeeping Jedi from the Old Republic. He silently stood by Leia in a symbolic and physical display of support as she, Vader, and Dangor confirmed the broad terms of their initial treaty proposals. Inwardly, however, his mind was far away with all that happened the previous day. The main bulk of the previous second day of the official negotiations had dragged by in 12 long hours of discussions. Exchanges had remained as loaded with subtle inferences as the first day, although outwardly the Alliance Party perhaps appeared more driven, fully playing out their role of being taken in by these talks. They had engaged in debate for the most part with Dangor, who was the main negotiator on the Imperial front, whether or not the Alliance High Command decided to make a deal with Vader. With the official negotiations being for naught, there was nothing to lose in playing the part. As if there really was something to be gained from these talks, numerous proposals on a whole range of issues, from Palpatine's totalitarian authority, reinstatement of the Senate and democratic elections of regional governments, to policies on education, slavery, and the treatment of non-humans, had been raised and dismissed, only to be revisited later and compromised, then rejected again, or occasionally accepted. Vader had contributed to the discussion only on matters regarding the security forces and the appointment of Alliance personnel. However temporary any agreements were supposed to be in his so-called plans to annihilate the rebellion, he had remained fully within the boundaries of what Palpatine might agree to, and flatly refused to relinquish his position as Supreme Commander of the Imperial forces. But as a compromise, he had offered to cease all summary executions without trial, effective immediately. Silence had greeted that statement until Leia conceded the point and returned to the issue of social care of minors. And it had been in Luke's rooms in the dead of night that he, Madine, Leia, and Vader had met again for the negotiations that really mattered. Leia and Madine had been prepared to argue intensely on various issues for which the Alliance felt strongly, mainly those which had already been discussed with Dangor earlier in the day, but the Dark Lord had surprised them by insisting on many of the points himself. If Vader was in earnest, which Luke knew he was, the Alliance had quite the advantageous offer on the table. But it was in the short hour in between these two very different negotiations where Luke's heart still lingered, when he had joined his father on the small veranda again beneath the stars scattered in the clear night sky. When he had excused himself, Leia had avoided his gaze, and he knew that she knew where he was going. She hadn't explained why she had suddenly accepted Vader being his father so quickly the previous night, and he hadn't pressed her, knowing she would talk about it when she felt ready. He had felt a twinge of guilt as he slipped out of the East Wing, but there was no hesitation as he headed out on a circuitous route to zoom in on his father's location. They had fallen easily into conversation and spoke with candor of their pasts. Luke described his poor but relatively happy childhood, and about growing up in the middle of nowhere where the highlights of his day had been racing Beggar's Canyon with his friend Biggs. He had been thrilled to discover that his father was the only human to have ever won the Boonta Eve Classic, and his heart warmed at the thought that before they had ever met, they had both raced the same deadly twists and turns many years apart. Anakin had spoken at length of his earlier life, his mother, Luke's grandmother, his life as a slave, how he had met Padme, his years of training as a Jedi Knight. And the more Luke had learned, the more the horror of the deeds committed by Vader seemed to pale. It wasn't that the evil was any less, but in the context of what had happened with his mother, and with Palpatine subtly guiding him towards the dark path, as had been explained the previous night, the fall of Anakin Skywalker and the nature of Darth Vader became more understandable. Luke couldn't even imagine what it must have felt like for his father to dream repeatedly of his mother's death and to have the considerable powers of the Force at his fingertips but be unable to prevent her brutal fate, and then to start dreaming about Padme's death. Luke remembered his own inner turmoil when his aunt and uncle had been murdered and honestly couldn't say how he would have reacted if the stormtroopers responsible had still been at the homestead when he had arrived. Instead of blaming his father, he found his heart going out to him. His life seemed to be that of great tragedy, interspersed with fleeting moments of happiness that were altogether too rare. And the reverent way his father had spoken of his mother, it was something that Luke would never forget. He was soon engrossed in the memories.
I was convinced you were going to be a girl.
Luke pulled a face that made his father grin.
But your mother knew you were a boy.
Anakin's gaze was lost somewhere in the moonlit darkness, and from his tone it was clear that his mind was far away.
She was a force to be reckoned with, Luke. When she fixed on an idea, not even the combined might of the Trade Federation or a vicious Nexu could stand in her way. She protected Naboo and all its people, whatever their species, and they recognized her dedication and loved her. She worried about the war and its devastating effect on so many people, but her courage was remarkable. She never gave up her single-minded campaign for diplomacy and democracy.
He smiled sadly.
And then there was the side that the public never saw, the side she showed only to me. She was full of warmth and compassion. Her laugh could light up the darkest night.
He suddenly started laughing.
I used to tease her so much. Once, for example, she was targeted by assassins, and I escorted her back to Naboo to protect her. We were up in the mountain meadows when I had a childish idea to ride a shack, but it threw me off and I just laid there in the grass. She ran over, all worried.
He trailed off, lost in his memories. What had happened after that was clearly the source of amusement, but Luke didn't prompt him, as he sensed his father's mirth quickly plummet into sorrow. Anakin's odd, sorrowful whisper infused the air around them.
I never knew anyone so loving, so beautiful.
Luke had never experienced such love as that which his parents had clearly shared, and had no idea how he might comfort him.
I'd like to go and visit her, he said.
Anakin smiled sadly.
She'd like that. I'll take you, when this is all over, and to Varikino.
Luke sat up straighter. Varikino?
Where we were married.
Luke's mouth formed an O as he finally understood why his father had chosen that name as his alias when assisting the rebellion. No wonder the Force had hinted at its significance when he had first heard it.
It's in the lake country here on Naboo, where the Naberi family had their retreat.
Luke had the distinct feeling he was missing something important. Naberi?
Padme's family.
Luke frowned. But I thought she was called Amidala.
Amidala was her regal name. She was born Padme Naberi.
Luke went still. Senator Pusha Naberi? The last senator of the Chomel sector was a common acquaintance of both Leia and Queen Calantha, and they had mentioned her briefly at dinner the previous night. Anakin nodded.
Your mother's sister, Sola, had 2 daughters, Ryu and Pooja. She is one of your cousins.
Cousins! When Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen had been killed, he had believed them to be the last of his family, but now he not only had a father, but also relatives on his mother's side. It felt almost unreal. He wanted to meet them, but was far from ignorant of the danger he would pose them if it became known that they were related to one of the Empire's most wanted. He had patience. He would wait for better times. The night breeze whispered around them, peacefully swirling as they sat side by side on the stone bench with their shoulders touching.
Did you build your new lightsaber?
Anakin asked after a while. There was obvious reluctance in bringing up the subject. They both knew when Luke had been parted from the last one. Luke nodded, slowly, finding the right words. It was soon afterwards when I returned to Tatooine. I was confused, and I went to Ben's old hut, hoping to find some answers.
Ben?
ObiWan. He was called Ben on Tatooine, Luke clarified. I didn't find what I was looking for, but I did unearth the blueprints, a furnace, and some tools to make a new lightsaber.
May I?
Anakin asked. Luke was surprised, but there was no hesitation as he unclipped his lightsaber and placed it in the outstretched palm. The hilt looked relatively small, grasped in his father's large gloved hands. The blade hummed to life, casting their features in a green glow. He could feel his father inspecting it with the Force, sensing the crystal and the complex alignment within. Anakin turned it over in his hands several times before deactivating it and handing it back.
You made it well, son.
Luke felt joy bubbling up inside as if he was a small boy again. With a shy smile, he tucked his lightsaber away just as his comlink began beeping. He checked the screen before turning it off. It's time, he said reluctantly. He didn't know when they would next be able to spend time together like this. Anakin abruptly turned to him and made a curious request.
Say ah.
What?
Say ah,
Anakin repeated. Luke complied, feeling rather self-conscious. He broke off with a startled cry when Anakin brushed a swab on the inside of his mouth.
And blink,
Anakin said before Luke could protest. Some black contraption was thrust in Luke's face, and he automatically blinked as a pale blue light flashed in his eyes.
I put your left hand here,
Anakin added. He shoved something at Luke's chest, who reflexively pushed it away.
Perfect.
What are you doing? Luke asked, curious but not particularly concerned as he watched his father tug away the various implements which had materialized out of the small compartments of his utility belt. Anakin's reply was uninformative.
Something which should have been done many years ago.
They faced each other, neither keen to leave. Anakin placed a firm hand on Luke's shoulder, a comforting, familiar gesture that Luke was beginning to like very much. It simply felt right, as if his father's hand and his shoulder had been designed to fit together. Anakin regarded him for several cycles of his respirator.
I am very proud of you, Luke. Your mother would have been as well.
Something welled up inside, and Luke found that he couldn't speak. Anakin gave his shoulder a squeeze before letting go.
Come on, your friends are waiting.
Then he leapt up the vines and disappeared over the veranda. Luke briefly refocused on the conversation around them to find that Leia and Dangor were drawing the discussion to a close. He glanced at the dark armored figure, silently watching the proceedings. Although the mask was turned towards the conversation, he knew that Anakin's attention was on Luke. And sure enough, a moment later, his father's voice was in his head.
You've been far away, son.
Luke smiled faintly. Just thinking about things. There was an understanding murmur before his father's tone became serious.
If you ever need assistance and you cannot get a hold of me, you can call on Firmus Piet, the admiral on the Executor. He knows you are my son and that I no longer hold any loyalty to the Empire.
Do you trust him?
I wouldn't have told him otherwise. He is a good man. He cares little for Palpatine's evil. His primary concern is his family.
A family man, like his father. Sadness washed over Luke at the thought that they would soon be parting again. He was deeply appreciative of every second they had spent together, even of something as simple as the comfortable silence they had shared. It felt as if they had known each other all their lives. Their connection in the Force had grown remarkably, and even in such a short time they had forged a solid bond born of honesty and trust. They were ready to face Palpatine and any treachery the Sith Master could try to throw at them. It was in that moment that Luke realized he harbored no resentment over the loss of his hand. At some point over the last 2 days, he had forgiven his father wholeheartedly for what had happened on Cloud City. He also forgave him for choking his mother, if it was his place to forgive him for that. Anakin had accomplished the impossible and returned from the dark side of the Force. What greater testimony could there be for the strength of his love? Whatever Vader's past, it was his father, Anakin Skywalker, who stood on the other side of the room, with his feet firmly on a better path. Leia and Dangor were exchanging final words, expressing their hope that the Empire and Rebel Alliance would soon reconvene to sign the treaty. It was now or never. I would gladly have given my whole arm, and so much more, to have my father back, There was a jolt from the other end of their mental link as Luke sent forth his forgiveness and love. Anakin's heart swelled, and he was too overwhelmed to respond. But Luke didn't need an answer. He could sense his father's emotions as clear as day. Luke smiled as he fell into step with Chewbacca to follow Leia and Maydeen from the palace.